longer somebody sits in political office, the bigger their entrenchment can ultimately become. It's much different if you're dealing with somebody who's been in office for, let's say, 3 or 4 terms versus somebody who's been there for 20 terms. Scary thought, but I do think that just the fact that any type of electoral reform is a topic of major discussion because it will get a floor vote, I think is going to put how do you guys see it?
I think it's absolutely right. And I think if you want a good example of this, just look at the effect of ranked choice voting on New York City Council. A couple of years ago, when the New York City adopted ranked choice voting via charter commission amendment process. And all of a sudden, a council that had been the province of men and the old guard and New York's political establishment, it changed almost overnight. For the first time in the history of the council, it's now majority female. You saw firsts and people of color representing communities that had never had representation on the council before suddenly winning seats. You saw young people winning seats. It was a revolutionary change. And the folks who won office there credit ranked choice voting for making it happen.
Yeah, I do think the ranked choice voting provides different communities more opportunity and more power to express.
You guys have any thoughts?
I'm sorry, guys. You're kind of cutting out a little bit.
We're working on it. What your thoughts on the term limits and obviously the concessions that were made, Mickey?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there's kind of the catch-22 on term limits. Of course, I'm in the legislature now because I was a public school teacher and I ran for office after epic revenue failure in Oklahoma due to trickle-down economics. I was one of about 500 teachers laid off due to lack of funding. And so I decided to advocate for my students and fellow teachers from inside the Capitol by running for office. And here we are about 7 years later, and there's a whole new bunch. I would say about half of the legislature is now new and did not experience that tumultuous and very difficult time when we had no money and we were having to cut revenue to core services. And we have a one-time infusion of federal dollars. And guess what's on the legislative agenda this year? It's tax cuts. And so one of the problems with losing or turnover of legislators is they're real quick to forget the history of what got us into some terrible situations. Also, a lot of institutional knowledge is left. Of course, the lobbyists and the people who hang around the Capitol for decades, they retain all of that. And when you understand how the process works and all of that, it gives you an advantage. And so while I am not keen on, like we have in Oklahoma, 12-year term limit, so I'm going into year 7, and I'm just at the point where I'm like very familiar with most of our agencies, and I've got great relationships built up, and in 6 years I'll be gone if I can continue getting elected. But on the flip side, I don't think you should be like James Inhofe and serve 60 years in the Senate or however long he served. Prior to his retirement this past year, he was the longest serving senator in the U.S. Senate. And so while I think that it shouldn't be like a 60-year term limit, I also think that 12 years is a little short. So maybe something right in the middle, maybe like 24 or 30 years or something like that. But, of course, you want to give people the opportunity to jump in and have a chance. I know that some states, they'll have a 12-year term limit, and then you have to have a cooling off period of 4 years or 6 years, and then you can run again. So there's like a balance, and I think balance to everything is welcomed and good. But at the same time, I've just seen so many really smart but experienced legislators get termed out and then get replaced with someone who's very, very new and naive and votes in ways that they won't have to be responsible for. So, for example, coming up with these tax cuts, if they do vote for tax cuts, many of them are thinking, well, I want to vote for tax cut because it's good for my next reelection. And whoever inherits the legislature in 12 years, it's not going to be my problem. A whole new legislature is going to have to come in and fix it. So it really skirts some of the responsibilities for future planning and making really smart decisions when it comes to policy that's going to pan out really well for decades and not just what's convenient or advantageous for your next reelection.
Yeah. And I'll say, the Forward Party doesn't have an official stance on term limits. It's the kind of thing we would be open to, but isn't a platform plank. But I think, to talk also about, not to just pivot everything back to RCV, but I think it's really useful to think about the way in which that helps to be a quasi-term limit, which is to say that if a legislator stops being productive, if a legislator becomes corrupt, or if it's revealed corruption, there's always a possibility of somebody like a George Santos conning their way past everyone and getting elected into a position of power. But the primary system and then the general election systems that we currently have inculcate these people from facing real consequences, even as their independence or as their legislative prowess or even mental faculties sometimes decline, because you have basically like a 12% approval rating for Congress right now, but like a 94% reelection rating. And it's because the rabid primary voters ardently reward incumbents. And then once they get into these general elections, they're predominantly in safe districts, and so they get reelected. Well, reforming this entire electoral process, age limits is kind of like that. There are term limits, sorry, not age limits. Term limits is kind of like that thing you put into place because you can't figure out how else to get rid of some of these people. But the reality is that reforming the primary and general election process to open this all up might give you essentially de facto term limits, where people who aren't just cutting the mustard anymore, we have a much easier way of getting rid of them.
It's really hard to get rid of people when something like...
Yeah, I mean, that...
It's really hard to get rid of people when something like 35 congressional districts in the country are actually considered competitive out of 435. And in those 400 races, it is a one party uncompetitive primary. And if you've got multiple candidates in those races, you are going to have a fraction of the people choosing everyone's representative. And what we just saw in the speaker's fight, right? So many of the members of Congress that were dragging that vote on and pushing the caucus further and further to the right, further to an extreme where most Americans are not, were elected from the most gerrymandered states in the country, from Florida, from Texas, from Arizona, from Ohio, and they were oftentimes folks like Matt Gaetz, who were elected with just a fraction of support in a party primary. With ranked choice voting, you would see a different kind of member, a member who is incentivized to work in an entirely different way.
Yeah, you definitely bring up a great point, and a couple of thoughts that I also want to get from you guys. One of the other concessions, and you and Mike, you were bringing up a really great point in terms of not just the fact that these districts are so gerrymandered, but that because of the money factor, it becomes so unlikely that you're able to knock off an incumbent. It's like a 94% success rate of reelection. But another major concession that the populist GOP was able to get from McCarthy was now in the GOP primaries, if it is an R-safe district, and obviously there could be a definition as to what a safe district is. My guess is anything that's over a +7. Those districts cannot be challenged, or the RNC will not get involved. If two candidates in the same party want to run against each other for the nomination, even if it's a 20-year incumbent, have at it. I think there needs to be immense pressure put on the Democratic Party to follow suit and do the same thing. How do you guys see it?
Well, I'd say it's an interesting debate. First of all, I'm very uneasy with the idea that governmental decisions, essentially who runs Congress, hinged on explicitly campaign demands. That's a very disgusting place for our politics to be in the first place. But I will also say, yes, I'm a former Republican. I'm somewhat of an institutionalist in the sense of, like, there used to be a sense that these, Mitch McConnell's leadership fund, that the House Majority Leader's leadership fund was used to keep some of the crazies out of primary systems. I think McConnell still views it that way. I'm not sure McCarthy does, but that explicit promise to stay out of playing in those primaries, one potential negative effect is that MTGs and people like that who are extremely popular with a very rabid base will have no opposition from a larger funded opponent. Now, I don't like that process. It's not a pretty way to depict our politics, that the incumbent political powerhouses are the ones picking and choosing in primaries. But there is a real danger, I think, about radicalism. And again, this all goes back to the primary process. Such few percent of people do vote. Such few percent of people even can vote in explicitly partisan primaries. And as a result, someone like a Marjorie Taylor Greene, someone like Matt Gaetz, they have a much greater chance if there's no larger kind of normalizing, moderating force trying to run against them in primaries. So I think it's explicitly a demand from the Freedom Caucus that's designed to increase the number of people in the Freedom Caucus. And given, I think, who many of the Freedom Caucus members are and their relation to January 6th, that has me very worried.
Yeah. My thought on, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Mike put it really well, but it's another example of how elections have consequences. And when they got the power to govern, they have, the choice to make those inter caucus rules. And it's just another example of why it's so important to have electoral reform and to actually show up and vote when that does happen, to prevent situations like this from becoming more prominent.
Yeah, my thought on this is when I look at somebody like Marjorie Taylor Greene, to me, that's like the poster child for we need term limits, because it's like, if we had a completely legitimate electoral process that was really indicative of what the majority of people want, then we wouldn't need term limits. Then the vote is the term limit. And I completely get that. And in my ideal universe, that would be the case. But what we have is sort of like a chicken and an egg thing. And at this point, for me, I'm willing to throw whatever shit against the wall to get something to stick, to get some of these people out of there. Because even though there are lifelong great public servants like Bernie Sanders, for every Bernie Sanders, there's how many people that Mitch McConnell's. And so we have to think about right now, what would be the best way to change some things around. And that's why I like the idea of term limits. It isn't necessarily the permanent solution. It really isn't. And I understand that there's debates as to what a term should be and all of that. But right now, there are way too many people like Dianne Feinstein and Nancy Pelosi. And that tends to be the problem, way more so than, unfortunately, having to get rid of people that would be good lifelong public servants, which is like Bernie.
Thanks for watching. If you want to support our mission to transform politics into service, please like this video, subscribe, follow us on social media, and consider joining our Patreon, where you'll get early access to our interviews as well as other exclusive content. Links are in the description. Peace out.